Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. Now, today we are taking you into the depths of the Cold War, to dark stories of intrigue, espionage, and torture. So let's roll back to 1959. A man whose name will become notorious, Lee Harvey Oswald, enters the Soviet Union and claims to be a defector. Let's roll forward to another year later, and we're in a prison in Cuba called the Isle of Pines. And there, a CIA scientist called David Lamar Christ is being horribly tortured by brutal Cuban and Russian interrogators. And he's revealing all about a secret program he knows all about. Let's also go to Vienna in 1961, and the new president, JFK, is having a conversation with Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev complains about things that the CIA are doing that JFK knows nothing about. And let's just call this show a series of unfortunate events, because we now need to roll forward to 1984. And a researcher by the name of Jamie Shandera opens an envelope that's been sent to his home in Los Angeles, and out rolls a roll of film. And when developed, this film shows images of documents that have become notorious. MJ-12, Majestic 12. These documents purport to reveal that the Roswell 1947 incident was the crash of an alien spacecraft, and that technology and bodies were recovered, and that the whole thing was covered up by President Truman, and it's been overseen by a committee known as Majestic 12 in the years since. Now, I've long been a skeptic about Majestic 12, and I still am. I think we should be. We should be very, very skeptical about documents that bob up from nowhere. But today, you're going to meet a very interesting person called Jeff Cruikshank. He's a former Australian intelligence official who's worked in an agency so secret, I can't even tell you what it is. But he has had a top secret SCI clearance. He's very briefed into the intrigue inside the Five Eyes Alliance. And today, he's going to tell all about what he's discovered about a very dark period of Cold War history. But first, before I bring Jeff in, I am delighted to announce that we have a sponsor on Reality Check. And that sponsor is none other than a martial arts god that when I was a little boy, I worshipped intensely. I had his posters on my wall, and he inspired me to learn karate and other martial arts as a young teenager. I'm talking about Chuck Norris. When I was a little boy, there was one movie that I went to watch about 5 times in 1972 called The Way of the Dragon. And it was Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris facing off against each other in the Colosseum in Rome. It was just mighty stuff. And would you believe Chuck Norris is now 84 years old. And while I have broken hands and knees and ankles because of my foolish interest in karate, whacking boards in a dojo late into the night, Chuck Norris's body defies explanation. The man is 84 years old, and yet he's still got the vigor of a man 30 or 40 years younger than him. He's still kicking butt and working out. And what's amazing is he's stronger, he can work out longer, and has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. He did this, he tells us, by making one change. And he says he still feels like he's in his 50s. His wife's even done the same thing as well, and she's never felt better. She says she feels 10 years younger. Her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. And Chuck's made a special video that explains everything. And make sure you help us and Chuck by watching it. If you go to chuckdefense.com/Ross and click in the link below in this video, It'll change the way you think about your health. Now, once again, that's chuckdefense.com/Ross. Click on the link in the description below to watch the video. You won't believe how simple it is. Just a reminder, the legendary Chuck Norris is a whopping 84 years old, and yet he's got more energy than me. And his body may be broken, but for some reason, he seems to be able to keep on going. I want to know his secret. I'm going to click on that link. What he's discovered that he could effect dramatic changes to his health simply focusing on three things that sabotage our body as we age. Watch his method by clicking on the link in the box below, chuckdefense.com/Ross. And now, from martial arts heroes onto Cold War intrigue, let's bring in Jeff Cruikshank. Jeff, welcome to Reality Check. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself within the confines of what you're allowed to reveal as a former Australian intelligence official.
Yeah, good morning, Ross. Pretty hard to beat that introduction. I was involved in automation for defence from 2005. 2009, I joined an agency as a contractor, which I obviously can't talk about. From 2014, I got a special endorsement to certify skiffs for the Australian and American governments, where I designed, built, and certified those facilities to hold information up to the top secret level.
Now, I want to start, Jeff, with JFK, because it's the logical starting point. JFK knew a bit about UFOs, you contend. Tell me why you think JFK knew something about the phenomenon.
Well, he knew quite a bit, Ross, as he entered the Oval Office in 1961. But what he didn't know was the existence of a very, very highly classified program called Palladium that was injecting false UAP signals into the Soviet air defense system, messing with their heads. And the man that was one of the masterminds of that program, as you alluded to, was David Lamar Christ, who was the CIA's real life equivalent of James Bond's Q character. And he was languishing in the prison in Cuba. And I bet Alan Dulles and James Angleton wish they had a real life Chuck Norris to extract him from that prison.
So basically, Lamar Christ told all to his Russian and Cuban interrogators, do we assume?
Well, in his debrief, he was released in 1963 in April in a deal negotiated by James Donovan, who was the head of the OSS. General James Donovan was also a trained lawyer. In his debrief, the CIA found that Dave Christ had actually lied about what he'd told the Cubans, and he was prevented from leaving the country after that. That's a CIA document.
So what are you sourcing that to? Are you sourcing that to documents? Because I'm very skeptical. I want to be upfront with you, Jeff. I'm very skeptical about the so-called Majestic 12 documents because I do think some of the later ones, at the very least, are dubious. But it's always been a question in my mind whether the first bundle of documents that were sent to ufologist researcher Jamie Shandera in 1984, it's always been a question in my mind whether the documents that he was sent, which purported to detail the Roswell crash and what Truman did about it, whether they were authentic and as part of a disinformation program. Is it the case that later on the documents that were subsequently released by other parties were an attempt to sow disinformation, to essentially cast aspersions over the authenticity of all of the purported MJ12 documents? So in terms of the Operation Palladium that you're talking about, Palladium, what are you saying? Are you saying that Operation Palladium is a proven operation that the CIA was running that isn't part of the MJ12 documents?
Yes, that's correct. That was declassified in 2003. One of the architects, Bud Whelan, spoke about it to the Roadrunners in 2003, and he said in that talk that they were recently declassified.
So let me get this right. What the CIA was doing out of Atsugi in Japan and Peshawar in Pakistan was they were sending up spurious signals through radar that were tricking the Soviet air defense warning over the horizon radar into thinking that what they were seeing were UFOs, UAPs?
Just phantom signals. They weren't sure what they were because at the time, this is the period before that ICBMs are actually the prime delivery method for nuclear weapons. So General Curtis LeMay's Strategic Air Command was the primary delivery mechanism for nuclear weapons to Soviet targets.
And so what they were doing was facilitating the ease of passage of the spy planes, the U-2 spy planes that were flying over the Soviet Union, because if the Soviets couldn't distinguish between those spurious signals, those UAPs, if you like, the UFOs, unidentified objects on their radar, they couldn't figure out what was a real spy plane or what was a spurious signal. Is that the point?
That's correct. And they use, in the intelligence world, they use similar words to describe similar things like PSYOP is a psychological operation, but PSYOP with an S, SIOP, is a single integrated operating plan, which is the integration of US Air Force, US Navy to deliver nuclear weapons. It's also called
Now,
PSYOP.
the thing I find incredible, Jeff, is that what you're describing is that General Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force at the time, he actually had a first strike plan for nuclear attack, didn't he? That what these documents show is Curtis LeMay, the general in charge of the Air Force, was contemplating using these spurious signals, the PSYOP, as a way of launching a first strike on the Soviet Union to take them out.
That's correct. They were using the U-2s to test the Tall King radars, which were VHF over the horizon radars, which would then direct the SA-2 anti-aircraft missiles onto either bombers or the U-2 spy planes. So they needed to map where those Tall Kings were.
Okay, so just explain to me, why does this matter? I mean, what's the relevance of this to the whole UFO anomalous phenomena issue? Who cares? Why is it relevant to this debate?
Because there was evidence that there were actually UFOs and UAPs flying around at the time. The Washington flyover in 1952 was a dedicated, what they call in the military, a show of force by someone. So rather than working with the Soviets to figure out what this force was that had flying within our airspace with impunity, they decided to use psyops to trick the Soviets, and the Soviets did it back as well, I guess.
So what was it that David Lamar Christ revealed when he was under torture in Cuba? He revealed the existence of Operation Palladium, and that's why Khrushchev knew about it to reveal it to Kennedy in 1961. Is that right?
That's correct. David Lamar Christ was the first scientist ever recruited by CIA in 1950. He was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base on the 23rd of December 1952. He went to a facility just called the Plant that was involved in the nuclear energy for propulsion of aircraft, 1957. He got a Q clearance for restricted data for nuclear weapons, and he was supposed to be an audio security expert. I think that was his cover. He had clearances for everything. He had a team of 20 scientists working under him, one of which was James W. McCord in 1955. Now, James
It was one of the
McCord was
Watergate
also,
burglars.
yep, sure was.
So why was the CIA's top scientist going to Cuba to presumably do bugging or some kind of espionage operation? Wasn't it incredibly risky if he had this secret in his head about this secret operation called Palladium?
Well, he got briefed the day before he went into Cuba on the 11th of August, 1960, on a secret program that we've got the briefing classification notes for, but the name of the program is redacted. He was apparently going in to plant a bug in a Chinese radio station, but I believe he was possibly installing equipment to inject the palladium signals from the Chinese radio tower within Cuba. And now, someone that you've interviewed before, T.D. Barnes, has stated in a 2019 interview with Tim McMillan that palladium was in use in Cuba in 1960.
So, what the CIA was doing was grossly improper because the president wasn't even briefed into this operation, and it was potentially risking a confrontation between the Soviet Union and America because the Soviets might have interpreted that spurious data that looked like UAPs to be some kind of American attack. Is that your point?
Yes, that's correct. And the person they thought was going to be the president was Richard Nixon, who ran the 5412 committee. He knew all about palladium. He approved it. The Isle of Pines in the planning in the 18th of August 1960 National Security Council meeting, which was also a 5412 group meeting, they discussed the Isle of Pines as a bridgehead during the Bay of Pigs invasion on the proviso that they had air cover.
So, the origins of the whole Bay of Pigs case, there's an untold story that people don't realize the historical significance of. That not only were there a bunch of emigre Cubans supported by the CIA endeavoring to overthrow the Castro regime, there was also a CIA operation that was in jeopardy because one of their top scientists was being tortured in a Cuban prison and being forced to reveal this secret operation that was essentially a preparation by a nut job in the US Air Force called Curtis LeMay to essentially create its first strike capability against the Soviets.
That's correct. And LeMay had experienced UAPs firsthand in World War II, so he knew all about it. The psychological effects on pilots, his pilots experienced that and started faking engine failures.
Now, you claim that there may be some validity to the MJ12 documents, these controversial Majestic 12 documents, because of things that you've discovered in the National Archives that you believe verify the authenticity of these Majestic 12 documents. Now, I don't want to bog our audience down in too much detail, so let's just go through this very, very carefully. What is it that's in the purported MJ12 documents that you believe goes to this issue of Operation Palladium? What's the story that hasn't been told before?
Because they directly reference palladium. And these documents surfaced 10, 20 years before it was even known about. Jean Petit wrote an article in a classified CIA book called Intelligence Research, Stories of Intelligence Research. And he states that only 6 people knew about palladium in the 1960s in the CIA itself.
And so who knew about it in 1984 when the existence of palladium was asserted in the MJ12 documents that were leaked to Jamie Shandera?
Probably T.D. Barnes, Petit, and a handful of other people.
So your point is that whoever it is that crafted the MJ12 documents, they had knowledge of what was at the time a CIA operation that was so secret, even President John F. Kennedy didn't know about it.
That's correct. Yeah.
So let's keep on working on this because I understand from what you've told me, Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was the first to tell JFK about the existence of this operation. He was complaining to JFK at a conference in Vienna in 1961 that this spoofing, this false signals spoofing was going on. Just explain that to me.
Well, that's correct. Khrushchev was a elder statesman, seasoned in diplomatic ways. John F. Kennedy, the young, vibrant American, a little bit naive in diplomatic relations, and Khrushchev's laid this on him from the first instance. MJ-12, you guys are fooling with our Soviet air defenses. You better knock it off or we'll get serious.
And so
Kennedy
did Khrushchev
goes away,
refer to MJ-12? Did Khrushchev
possibly.
use the nomenclature MJ-12?
I believe so, because President Kennedy left that meeting scratching his head, not knowing what Khrushchev was talking about. And then on the 28th of June 1961, he sends a directive to Alan Dulles and says, you need to tell me everything about MJ-12 and psychological warfare as they relate to Cold War efforts.
Now, that document that you're citing, that's one of the leaked MJ-12 documents, isn't it?
That's correct.
So
1995, it surfaced.
So it surfaced in 1995, and I'm sure there would be what does one call it? A battalion of splenetic debunkers who would say it's just a false document and it doesn't prove anything. Why do you think that presidential directive to the CIA director, Alan Dulles, is true?
Because in 2022, in the JFK assassination records release, Alan Dulles' event calendar was declassified from December 1959 to January 1962. And the only day in that diary where Alan Dulles meets President Kennedy personally twice in one day is the 28th of June 1961, the same day on that directive.
So there's a document in the MJ-12 files, these very disputed MJ-12 files, which has that date of the 28th of June 1961, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
And that's the date of a meeting between the CIA director, Alan Dulles, and President John F. Kennedy.
Twice.
Now, nobody knew about that meeting until that diary was declassified in 2022.
That's correct. Top secret, compartmented
And yet,
information.
somehow, in the 1990s, one of the MJ-12 documents surfaced which referred to that meeting twice on that day between the CIA director and President John F. Kennedy, corroborating what's in that MJ-12 memo.
That's correct. Yep.
So lay out the conspiracy for me, Jeff, because you believe, don't you, that what happened now was JFK was shocked that the CIA was essentially running what was a dirty black operation without disclosure to him as the chief executive, the head of the armed forces. He wanted the CIA to rein in its activities, and he instructed Alan Dulles to basically behave himself and give him a full briefing about palladium. Do
Yeah, that's
you
correct.
believe that there may in fact be a connection between JFK's decision to demand openness from the CIA and openness between the CIA and the Soviets on UAPs? Do you believe there may be a connection between that presidential order and the subsequent murder of John F. Kennedy?
Absolutely. Yep. NASAM 271, which is National Security Action Memorandum 271 on the 12th of November 1963, actually outlines to James Webb, the director of NASA, and to John McCone, the new director of the CIA, that he wants to work with the Soviet Union on outer space matters.
And you believe that's a reference to what we purportedly know from the MJ-12 leaked documents, that the president was secretly ordering the CIA to engage more openly with the Soviets about UFOs.
That's correct. He wrote a directive not to John McCone, but to James Jesus Angleton, the director of counterintelligence of the CIA.
And what did he tell Angleton in that alleged MJ-12 memo?
He asked Angleton to look at declassifying all the current US UFO information that the CIA had.
Now, Jeff, this, of course, has been raised before. It's been dismissed by the debunkers and I'm sure some CIA historians as wacky conspiracy theories. Why do you think it has validity that there might be a connection between what I'm absolutely sure was a conspiracy to murder JFK? I do not for a moment believe, and this is something that we've done a story about previously with News Nation, I do not for a moment believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. I think the evidence is overwhelming that there was some kind of a conspiracy involving the CIA, and our audience is welcome to look at the News Nation episode we did on that, a very deep investigation into the JFK assassination on the 60th anniversary of his murder. But why do you believe that you can scotch the debunkers and assert that you think that those MJ12 documents are authentic?
There's so much that's come out in the JFK assassination records that, and other declassified records. For instance, the IPU report. Well, number one, there's established fact that there was a department of the counterintelligence corps called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. That's a fact. That was revealed in 1992 from a FOIA request.
So, what's the significance of the nomenclature Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit? Was that also something that's mentioned in the MJ12 documents?
Yeah, that's a very famous MJ12 document, the IPU report, which is about Roswell. And
so, just talk us through that. Talk us through that document, and let's talk about it as if we've got it on screen.
So it's written by the US Army's counterintelligence corps, who were actually prevented from accessing the Roswell crash debris and, in particular, the bodies. And it outlines their frustration at not being able to get access to that wreckage. One interesting thing on the cover of that report is what's known as a dissemination limiting marker. And it's been mostly redacted, but there's a few words that bleed out the end. And it's called a magic DLM. And magic with a G was an actual declassified only in 2005, was diplomatic cables from deep within the Japanese government in World War II. And the existence of the magic with a G DLM was spoken about in 1995, but it wasn't published until 2005. The IPU document has one of those DLMs on it, and that document surfaced in 1992. So again, it's revealed classified information that at the time that it surfaced was not known. And the reason they would have used that DLM is because the structure to maintain that information was already in existence for the magic with a G information from Japan. And after August 1945, that information is still classified today. So they've just reused a compartment, changed the G to a J, again for obfuscation, and reused the DLM.
So you believe Magic, MAJIC, Magic 12 or Majestic 12 was a real nomenclature used to conceal what is potentially the biggest secret in the United States?
Yep, that's correct. The CIA used a series of what they call bigrams, two-letter bigrams for their routing system to send information around through all their stations around the world. MH was Angleton's, the MH chaos system was a notorious one that was revealed in the Church Committee hearings. MK is well known for MK Ultra. Another one would have been MJ.
Isn't the more plausible explanation, Jeff, that the Majestic documents were what some people in the CIA have tried to explain them away as an effort by the Americans to persuade the Soviets to spend a useless amount of money on investigating things that didn't exist? That's always been the explanation that I have to admit I've bought on the Majestic 12 documents, that Jesus James Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA, was essentially creating these false documents in order to divert the Soviets into a fruitless investigation into UFOs. You don't buy that?
Well, that's what Angleton's job was, to, psychological warfare on the Soviets. But what happened after the Vienna conference was Khrushchev told Kennedy to knock off the Palladium system program. Kennedy knew nothing about it. And again, as Danny Sheehan explained about the raids on Cuba, the CIA were running their own show down there. Kennedy probably realised that after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Khrushchev told him to knock it off. That didn't happen, so Khrushchev upped the ante and said, we'll put missiles in Cuba to get around the early warning system. You'll have 5 minutes warning before a nuclear attack, and that's what precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Wow. So this is an alternative counter-history that I don't think a lot of people in the public are even aware of. You believe not only that the Majestic documents are real, but that there's enough on the historical record that is authenticated by genuine, confirmed archives documents, CIA documents, to show that the CIA was running these black operations without the knowledge of the president, and that the president was essentially ordering the agency to engage more openly with the Soviets about UFOs.
Yeah, that's correct. The Palladium was formalised when Bud Whelan came on board from TRW, which made almost everything for the US military. So that they had no intention of rolling back Palladium, and it just escalated from there. Kennedy had no control over that. Dulles responded in November 1961, the 5th of November, and said basically, and it's that document that actually specifies the Palladium specifics about injecting signals into Soviet air defences, and those sorts of operations. And right at the end, when Kennedy is asking about MJ12, Dulles says, the details of those operations are properly classified under the 1954 Atomic Energy Act. So the President of the United States does not have a need to know about those operations. Kennedy fired
So
him
that's
10
in the
days
MJ12
later.
documents. I find it hilarious that the head of the CIA would ostensibly be telling the President of the United States, the commander of the armed forces, that he has no right to know about something that's properly classified under the Department of Energy laws. I mean, legally, that's bullshit, surely.
That's the way the US law is written. And as you've often said, that US presidents are often considered temporary employees.
So obviously, Kennedy, you believe there's enough on the historical record verified by things like the diary entries that you've found. And it was you that found those diary entries, wasn't it, in the National Archives, and realised their significance?
That's correct. Yeah.
So just so I'm clear on this, the MJ12 document, whose authenticity has always been disputed, that was leaked to a ufologist in the 1990s. That document referred to two meetings held on the one day between the CIA Director Dulles and President Kennedy on the 28th of June 1961, correct?
Well, those documents weren't actually Jamie Shandira's. These other documents were from walk-ins to researcher Timothy Cooper in 1995. So there's several batches of Majestic documents that come under that umbrella.
Yeah. No, I understand, but essentially your point is, how on earth could whoever it was that created those documents and gave them to Timothy Cooper in the 1990s, how could they have known that the CIA director met with President Kennedy twice on the one day on the 28th of June 1961 unless they had inside information that was subsequently only revealed and declassified by the JFK Assassinations Review Board in 2022.
That's correct. And Ryan Wood and Timothy Cooper know who those walk-ins were that supplied those documents. I've got my own suspicions who they were through handwriting analysis. And obviously, one of the people involved was a Russian guy who emigrated into the US in the early 1930s, joined the US military in 1941, joined the US Army Counterintelligence Corps in 1942, and worked in Germany after the war with Henry Kissinger, debriefing Nazi rocket scientists for the paperclip program.
And so you believe that there is a very credible provenance for where those documents could have come from.
That's correct, because this guy, Boris Dmitry Tarasov, left the Army CIC in 1945 and then went to work for the Red Cross in Cleveland, Ohio for 5 years, which I believe is a cover for the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit of the CIC, operating out of Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio. What's interesting about Tarasov is he then joined the CIA in 1957 and worked in Mexico City, where he was a Russian translator, and he was the one that translated the purported person that was supposedly Lee Harvey Oswald as he went to the Soviet embassy and the Cuban consulate to ask for a visa in August and September 1963. So Boris Tarasov was the one that translated Lee Harvey Oswald's conversation in Mexico City.
So this is the fascinating thing is you actually believe that it's utterly implausible that Lee Harvey Oswald was the innocent defector, pro-communist defector that he was portrayed as by the Warren Commission, that the evidence overwhelmingly is that because of his involvement in Operation Palladium, he was a stooge. He was a patsy for the CIA going into the Soviet Union to find out about what their tall king over the horizon radar was capable of.
That's correct. And I'm not the first person by any means to say that. And in fact, it was Francis Gary Powers in 1970 that said Lee Harvey Oswald assisted in the shooting down of my U-2 aircraft. That I found that on the CIA reading room.
So just explain that to me. Do you think there's evidence to support that Oswald was actually allowed to leak the paths of the U-2s to the Soviets to give credibility to himself so that he could find out more from the Soviets on the capabilities of their radar? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yep, absolutely. Oswald was a walk-in in October 31, 1959 to the Soviet embassy, or the American embassy, sorry, in Moscow, and wanted to renounce his US citizenship. So he's a walk-in to the Soviets. He's got to prove how valuable he is. So, as they say in the game, he's prove his bona fides. And as Powers says in his article, there was only 2 U-2 flights over the Soviet Union after Oswald walked in on Halloween 1959. The first one went off without incident. The second one didn't. That was the one he was shot down in. So to prove his bona fides, he gave information to the Soviets about where they were running U-2 flights from.
But why would the Americans give Lee Harvey Oswald sensitive information about the flights of their U-2 spy planes just to find out about the Soviet radar systems? What was the benefit for the CIA in doing that?
They were old platforms. They had the Oxcart program, which is a precursor to the SR-71 spy plane. They knew they were vulnerable to the SA-2s. They were very, just their design for stealth was sort of old hat, very low wing lift ratios. So, yeah, that was a dangle as Angleton would call it.
So let me get my head around this, Jeff. I mean, one of the most notorious Cold War episodes was the shooting down by the Soviets of Gary Powers' U-2, something the CIA had actually told the president was impossible. They were very confident that the U-2s, they told the president, could not be shot down by the Soviets. You're actually saying that you think that Gary Powers was a sacrificial lamb. He was knowingly sent to be shot down by the CIA to give credibility to Lee Harvey Oswald's insertion into the Soviet Union as a potential so-called defector.
That's correct. Powers' plane actually had palladium gear on it. It was called a Granger box, and the Soviets displayed that in the Kremlin, all the components that they'd recovered from the U-2 crash. But the problem for Lee Harvey Oswald was that Dave Criss' capture and subsequent torture revealed all that, so it negated his usefulness. The Soviets already knew.
Oh, I get it. So, because I mean, this is one of the things I do find hilarious. There's a great book by Tim Weiner. You've probably read it, called Legacy of Ashes, which tells a very good counter history of the CIA, and it basically describes what the CIA has done since World War II as an endless series of failures. It basically says that the CIA very rarely has had a successful operation because they've screwed up so often. You're suggesting that their stupid decision to send David Lamar Christ into Cuba, where he was captured by the Cubans and interrogated and tortured by the Russian KGB, that compromised their Operation Palladium in the Soviet Union and led to Lee Harvey Oswald's usefulness being compromised.
That's correct. That's why they put him in a radio factory in Minsk, working on a lathe. They already knew. They knew more than the game was up for Harvey Oswald by that time. And not only palladium, Christ knew about the potential Israeli nuclear weapons program as well. And that's why John McCone hurriedly leaked that story to John W. Finney in Seymour Hersh's book, The Samson Option. All their secrets were laid out.
So you've got, that's really interesting, because I didn't know until I read the Samson Option chapter that you referred me to, that the CIA was actually involved in helping the Israelis build a nuclear bomb.
Yeah, James Angleton's church committee testimony, which was only declassified 2 years ago, admits that they were giving assistance to the Israelis through uranium stolen from the nuclear rocket-powered program called NERVA. It was that from the NUMEC facility. And John McCone, was the AEC chairman at that time.
Now, I think at this stage, to be honest, Jeff, our audience's heads are spinning with the complexity of what we're talking about. So I want you to take me to the other bit of evidence that you've got that I just find fascinating. And this is the nuclear tests in the Pacific, where the Americans were testing a type of technology which essentially was designed to incapacitate ICBMs and possibly also satellites by using X-rays. Just explain to me what was going on, what this testing was all about, and talk me through what happened.
Well, McCone replaced Dulles, and obviously the management change was the same management as the old management. So Khrushchev said, "You're not playing the game. We know that you're fooling with our radar." And Jean Petit even mentions about the Cuban Missile Crisis in that classified report that he wrote. So they were fooling around with the radar system still. During the atmospheric test program known as Operation Dominic, there was a sub-program called Operation Fishbowl, which was nuclear weapons detonations in space or near space, where the effects of the nuclear weapons propagate differently from the atmosphere. And they discovered that high energy X-rays could actually take out incoming ICBM re-entry vehicles by a process called thermomechanical spallation, just from the high energy X-rays. But the design of the weapon was completely different to all the other EMP weapons that they developed. So it was an X-ray weapon, not a gamma ray weapon
Now, the thing
that
I
they
find fascinating
tested.
about this is it required the use of a large quantity of solid gold in the warhead of the weapon. Just explain that to me.
That's because gold in its outer valence shell only has one electron. So that's a process used in modern day X-ray machines called Bremsstrahlung radiation, where the electron is blasted out of the atom, and when it comes in vicinity of another nucleus of another atom, it actually orbits around the atom, but in doing so releases X-ray energy because you can't destroy or create energy. But yeah, that's what they were testing, and they'd failed 3 times. So they'd blown up an enormous amount of gold from the U.S. Treasury because that particular was called bluegill, the bluegill test, which was a specific X-ray test. It had failed 3 times. Kennedy was not happy because the gold was from the U.S. Treasury and it was vaporized. But
And so,
and what?
just tell me what happened in the key event that we have videos of. So there are
Well,
videos of what we're about to talk about. And when you're referring to those videos, can you actually specifically talk to the video so that our editors know what to include in this video?
yep. Uh, tensions are building up in Cuba. So there's a Atlas 8F missile test in the Cape Canaveral on the 19th of September 1962. It's a dummy test. There's no live warhead on it. They just want to see how accurate the re-entry vehicle is to the target. Um, Once the re-entry vehicle has separated from the main Atlas missile, it starts its re-entry run. There's pyrotechnics and other things. They call them penetration aids to fool radar. So if you try to shoot the warhead, you've got multiple targets to choose from. Once the penetration aids burn up, the RV is filmed by a high-flying KC-135 specialised aircraft run by EG&G of all people.
So the RV is a
Films,
re-entry vehicle.
yep, it's re-entering the atmosphere. It's travelling at Mach 18, which is 20,000 feet per second. And an object materializes right alongside it and paces this RV for uh, a minute and a half. So for
Now, how do we
the
know this? What's that source to? Is that an authentic
that's
document that sources that claim?
that was it's footage that Arrow has actually deemed a UFO incident, and they've put it in the National Archives. Anyone can see it. And I
Now,
found
this is the
the
bit I love.
flight test
Sorry,
report.
Jeff, I've just got to savor this for a moment. So this is a real UFO sighting of some kind of anomalous object that appeared next to the testing of a re-entry vehicle off an ICBM, an American ICBM. And this is traveling at 18 times the speed of sound. And what does
Yep.
this object do around this re-entry vehicle warhead?
It's quite strange because it seems to phase itself into existence and pulse, and then just travels alongside the re-entry vehicle for a minute and a half, and then slowly starts to phase itself out of existence.
So it's
Now,
clearly intelligently controlled.
well, yeah, the Americans are scratching their heads now, thinking, is this a Soviet payback for the palladium? Are they doing something to us now? So NASA and the US Air Force are unsure. I found the post-flight test report of that missile test, and they said that the object's origin or identification could not be determined. So they don't know. Um,
But the crucial point is, and I just want to re-emphasize this, Arrow, the Pentagon's UFO investigation office, the official UFO investigation office for the Pentagon, the last thing Arrow ever wants to do is acknowledge that a UFO is real and potentially anomalous, potentially perhaps NHI. But in this case, they've acknowledged that this is a real UAP. They haven't been able to explain it prosaically, and they acknowledge officially in one of their reports that this Atlas RV UAP object is real.
That's right. They put that in the category in the National Archives, UFO category. So we couldn't do that
Okay,
today,
so
Ross, with our technology, let alone in 1962, basically.
oh well, I mean, there's nothing. We have nothing that can fly at 18 times the speed of sound, and this is in the atmosphere too, isn't it? It's not in orbit.
It's just re-entering the atmosphere, yes.
Yeah.
So
Now, the
that's September
significance of that
19.
is,
That's in September 1962, in the lead up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 24th of October, Strategic Air Command have found the missiles getting moved to Cuba by Khrushchev, the intermediate range ballistic missiles, nuclear tipped. So Strategic Air Command goes to DEFCON 2. That's the only time in history that they've ever done that. So they're ready to go in for a preemptive nuclear strike to the Soviet Union. 17 selected targets, LeMay has called the Grand Tour. They're ready to go. So
and
on
just
the
to make the point here, if anything validates President Kennedy's concern that whether they're spoofed or whether they're real, like they apparently were in the Atlas test, whatever they are, these UAPs are causing a ramping of the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's a vindication for JFK's concerns that if the Soviets and the Americans weren't open with each other about UAPs, this could lead to a tragic confrontation where one side fears that the other side is launching some kind of preemptive attack. That's the significance of that UFO that was seen at the Atlas test, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
But then, Jeff, take me forward to what then happens, because there is another test and another set of videos. What do you find? What have you uncovered?
So on the 25th of October, about 15 minutes to midnight, they launched Bluegill Triple Prime, which is a Thor intermediate range ballistic missile, single stage, launches this special, it's called the XW X1, which is the gold spherical secondary X-ray nuclear weapon. They launch it around, they want to detonate it around midnight to get the maximum effect, because at that point of time in the day, the ionosphere is at its highest point, because it's like a teardrop shape from the Earth uh, in relation to the sun. So this weapon detonates at just a few minutes past midnight on the 26th of October, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's another two KC-135 aircraft. Its whole tests are fully instrumented, because they've never actually fired one of these weapons before, because it's failed the previous three times. So there's two KC-135s operated by EG&G, because they developed a special high-speed Rapatronic camera that take the footage, because in the, I believe it's possibly still the same today, the only way to determine a nuclear weapon yield is to watch its expansion rate in the first few microseconds of the detonation. So these two aircraft have got these high-speed cameras watching the detonation. One has the call sign Kettle 1. The other one has the call sign Kettle 2. So during the blast, Kettle 1, you can see an object, and the fireball is approximately only a few milliseconds after the detonation. The fireball is approximately a kilometre wide. A bright, fiery object tumbles out from within the nuclear fireball, and it's plain as day. You can slow it down and see this very bright object. It must be at least 50 to 100 metres long, tumble out from
And
within the nuclear fireball.
you believe that that is some kind of craft.
Just like the one that was following the Atlas 8F test, but this time it was a real warhead.
So this is speculation, of course, because we just simply don't know what was recovered. But you believe potentially there were non-human intelligences of some kind watching these American tests, keeping a very close observation on what was going on, and that because they were using this technology that was designed to knock out missiles with essentially an X-ray pulse, it also knocked out the UFO.
That's correct. The scientists put that detonation in a point in space and time that there was no other debris or aircraft or anything in the local area, because they wanted to see the weapons effects of this X-ray device. Now, what's interesting
Couldn't it be
is that
debris from
was
the missile?
no, because the missile is hundreds of kilometres away by that point in time. It's launched 170-kilometre apogee. It's released the re-entry vehicle. It's nowhere near it. There's nothing, and nothing that big either.
So, what I find really cool about this, Jeff, and you've been involved in helping uncover these videos from the Department of Energy, or at least explaining their significance. There's two videos, as you've explained, Kettle 1 on one aircraft, Kettle 2 on another. One of the videos is censored, isn't it?
That's correct. It's what they call X-ray phenomenology, because in normal atmospheric and sea level, X-rays are absorbed by nitrogen. But bluegill triple prime test was detonated at an altitude of 48 kilometres, so there's a lot less nitrogen at that height. So they use special filters to see the actual weapons effect inside the fireball, and you can clearly see a double pulse on that Kettle 2 footage that goes out and comes back in. It's the first and only time they've ever seen that footage, weapons effect, and that's critical nuclear weapons design information, that footage. And they've covered the exact point with a large white triangle where the object tumbles out from within on the Kettle 1 footage.
So, how do you think it came out that one of the videos from the other aircraft was released? Was that an inadvertent disclosure? Was that a mistake?
Uh, there's well-known animosity between Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore Labs. Lawrence Livermore ran one aircraft, Los Alamos ran the other, and there was a third one at what they call the conjugate point, where near Fiji, where it comes back from through the atmosphere, the magnetic field lines, and Sandia Laboratories were operating that KC 135. That was Kettle 3, but it was hundreds of kilometres away. So
I'll just
there was a
remind, I just
discrepancy.
want to remind, I just want to remind our audience that a few months ago we did a story with US Air Force generals who basically talked to us about how their fear at the moment is that the Russians are deploying exactly this kind of weaponry into orbit, and that potentially we could face an absolute catastrophe for not just the GPS systems that we operate, but also for all satellite communications and electrical communications internationally, if in the event of a conflict with the Russians, a weapon like this is used. And the irony is, and I reminded my interviewee about this at the time, the reason the Americans know this is because of this technology that was developed right back in the 1960s during the bluegill test, where they realized the formidable power of these weapons. And not only did they realize that it could knock out, I mean, I think the electricity and lights were knocked out in Hawaii, thousands of miles away, and there was even an effect on communications in New Zealand. This whatever this pulse was, it spread right across the Pacific Ocean, and I think it took the Americans by surprise just how large the effect was of this X-ray pulse weapon.
Yeah, that's correct. And I actually spoke to an eyewitness, a scientist that was working for Los Alamos during all those tests, and he agreed that the reason why the Kettle 1 footage was declassified and Kettle 2 wasn't was simply a personal difference in what should remain classified and what shouldn't. But what's interesting after that was the recovery effort that's documented in the ship's logs of the debris.
Okay, so tell me what happened.
There was 3 ships involved. There was instrumented pods that were deployed via parachute around the blast, like a few kilometres away, to measure X-ray and other technical details. These ships were recovering the pods. And in the deck logs of the USS Safeguard, which was a special salvage, the diver class ship, They in the deck logs it says that they've uncovered some spherical debris they'd never seen before. They couldn't identify what it was. It was highly radioactive, so it had something to do with the blast. And when they tried to hook this debris up with their nets, they lost all power to the ship, which is a little unusual because ships usually run with a split switchboard on their generation. So the generators are in parallel, but the switchboards are separately powered. So if you lose one generator, you won't lose total ship power. But they did lose total ship power, and the diver class also had a DC power generation system, which is different to the normal AC system. So that's a bit unusual. But the other thing that was very, very unusual was a ship named the USNS Point Barrow, which was a specialized cargo dock ship that you could sink the aft end and submerge it partially in water and recover objects. Now, that ship was only involved in ionospheric observations. It had no exposure to radiation whatsoever. But the Safeguard documented in its logs that the Point Barrow was involved in a special recovery effort in the days after the Bluegill Triple Prime test. And a government report in
So can I just stop you there
1983.
for a Jeff? Can I
Yep,
stop you for a moment there, Jeff? You
sure.
believe it's very likely that the United States recovered the object that is shown on the film falling, tumbling from the Operation Bluegill X-ray pulse test. Whatever it was that they knocked out of the sky, you believe that ship was involved in the recovery of that object.
That's correct. The Point Barrow logs have mysteriously disappeared, but a lot of the sailors and US air personnel involved in Operation Dominic started getting cancer in the 1980s. Surprise, surprise. So, US Department of Energy tasked a company called Carmen Tempo to investigate why there was such a high level of radiation and cancer. And they found that Point Barrow had the second highest levels of all 70 ships involved in Operation Dominic, the second highest level of cancer uh, in the whole fleet. And again, this ship was not involved in any activity officially that exposed it to radiation.
So you believe there's been a cover up. Basically, they've recovered potentially a non human craft that was observing the test, and they've kept it quiet by concealing what they know.
That's correct. And the office that oversaw Sandia and Los Alamos was called the Albuquerque Operations Office. That was part of the Atomic Energy Commission's Division of Military Application, which ran the Operation Dominic because of nuclear weapons involved. And the person at the time that was running the Albuquerque Operations Office was a guy named Lawrence Preston Guise, who just happens to be Jeff Bezos's grandfather, and a scientist that I think you've spoken to, Ross, who was a US presidential advisor to President Kennedy, was Harold Malgrim, and he has publicly stated that Lawrence Guise worked with recovered debris from a UAP down, and I believe that's Bluegill Triple Prime. That's where it went.
So let's summarize what we've got out of all of this, Jeff. You've got a president that was being misled about spoofing being done over the Soviet Union by the CIA that was making the Soviets terrified that they were being attacked by Americans. And essentially, it was in the context of both sides seeing UAPs, craft of some kind, that were never properly explained. And JFK was clearly aware of this concern and raising with the CIA director his demands that there be greater openness between the Soviets and the Americans about UFOs. You believe that's why, in light of all of what you've discovered, the MJ12 documents that show JFK urging the CIA to be more open with the Soviets about UFOs, you believe that might explain why JFK was murdered.
That's correct. There's another document called the Important Memo that states that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK had to get an emergency MJ-12 briefing. And I believe that's because the CIA lost control of the debris because the US Navy had control of the debris and sent it on its way to Albuquerque Operations Office.
And I think that's very significant because one of my sources who I can name was a former US Navy head of research, Nat Kobitz, who did acknowledge to me that the US Navy was peeved with the US Air Force. You know, he felt that the US Air Force was trying to control the narrative on UFOs and block the Navy and other arms of the armed forces from knowing about what the US Air Force know. There is a lot of inter-service rivalry. So what you're describing there does sound very plausible to me, that there was resentment inside the Navy, that the Air Force was trying to keep what they'd recovered at Roswell very secret.
Yep. And 27th of October 1962, that's when the second U-2 was shot down over Cuba. And Khrushchev did not authorize that shoot down. So the appearance of a non-human intelligence and a off-world craft in the middle of that crisis possibly helped to defuse the situation when both leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, realized that they weren't in control. There was faceless bureaucrats or military leaders in the background actually calling the shots and possibly made them step back from the brink of nuclear annihilation.
And that's why Khrushchev was so upset that JFK was murdered.
He got rolled in October 1964, I believe, himself by Brezhnev. So, yep.
But as I understand it, when JFK was murdered, I think one of Khrushchev's children has described his incredible sadness that JFK had been killed, because what is consistent with history is that JFK was being incredibly, he was making it an imperative for the Americans to deconflict with the Soviets and to avoid aggressive confrontation. He was much more conciliatory than sections of the military, including nutjobs like General Curtis LeMay, wanted him to be.
Yeah, that's correct. And that the NSA Intercept MJ-12 document specifically talks about phantom aircraft in Soviet radar systems. So that again, it's referencing palladium.
Wow. So there's an interesting counterfactual history. Take of it what you want, dear audience. I can tell you, Jeff's somebody with an impeccable pedigree and intelligence, and he's certainly done his analysis. I find the interesting parallels between what we do know from the official historical record and what we can corroborate from the presidential diaries. It's certainly intriguing. I don't know if I'm prepared to accept, Jeff, that all of the Majestic 12 documents are authentic, because I do suspect that some of them, at least, are disinformation. But you have twigged my curiosity. Is it possible? I mean, what comes out of what you're saying is, was JFK murdered in a conspiracy involving the CIA because he wanted to deconflict with the Soviets at a time when UFOs were a huge issue of concern between both nations? And he was urging the CIA to be more open on space matters.
And it'd be easy to find that out, Ross, if both presidential candidates declassify the rest of the JFK assassination records.
Do you think that's potentially what's being hidden in the JFK records? That essentially,
Absolutely.
to reveal any more of the JFK records might be the slippery slope that reveals this sordid secret that you're talking about?
Absolutely. Uh, the fact that, Oswald was involved in the U2, the CIA ran the U2 program from Atsugi. That's where he was based. So, the claim that they didn't know who he was before the assassination doesn't really hold water.
I've never believed Oswald was the simple acting alone innocent. I mean, he clearly was the patsy that he described himself to be. You did not become an operative at Sugi in what was essentially one of the most secret operations being operated by the CIA and the US Air Force unless you were very highly cleared and within the loop. I mean, Oswald was a radar operator. He was clearly well informed about Operation Palladium.
Yep, absolutely. Possibly J.D. Tippett wasn't supposed to die that day. He was supposed to execute Oswald to keep his mouth shut, and that didn't happen, which then became a problem.
There are so many wheels within wheels. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted you to hear Jeff Cruikshank's analysis, not because necessarily I agree with it. I'm going to reserve judgment and stay agnostic on the MJ12 documents, but I do think there is some very impressive connections that he cited there. I'll let you be the judge, but I'd certainly be very interested in hearing from anyone who can add to what Jeff Cruikshank's described here. I certainly do think there is an untold history about JFK's efforts to expose what he'd discovered on UFOs. And I do wonder sometimes, Jeff, whether it goes back to JFK's friendship with Forrestal, the then Secretary of the Navy, I think he was, in the 1940s.
Yeah, there's a famous photo of Forrestal surrounded by a gaggle of Allied admirals with a young Jack Kennedy cruising around in the background, cool as a cucumber with his Ray-Bans and suit and tie on.
Do you think it's possible that James Forrestal, when he was in defence, told JFK, the young congressman, or actually no, this would have been before he became a congressman, told JFK about the Roswell crash?
Well, that's what the IPU report states, that someone within the office of the new Air Force Directorate told JFK, and I believe that might have been Stuart Symington.
And what was his connection to Forrestal?
Well, I think it was the worst kept secret at the time. Roswell crashed, the Roswell Daily Record ran it on their front page on July 8th, and Harry Truman was asked about it on July 10th at a press conference. Sir, have you seen any flying saucers? He tried to diss the story and disregard it completely, but everyone knew.
So the implications of what you're saying, Jeff, are very weighty indeed. I just wonder sometimes whether a lot of people in America are even bothered to investigate their history to try to understand it. Because ever since I first looked at the conspiracy involving JFK's assassination, I've been in no doubt whatsoever that there was a conspiracy to kill the president. And it went far beyond Lee Harvey Oswald. Perhaps you're offering a potential explanation. Jeff Cruikshank, thank you so much for speaking to Reality Check. We'll have you on again another time.
Thanks, Ross.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of News Nation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.